It was the fall of 2021. At the time, my name's Daniel, and I was living in Sacramento. One weekend I decided to drive north to visit my older sister in a small coastal town called Crescent City. The drive along the Northern California coast is incredible during the daytime, but at night it's a completely different experience. The roads are dark, quiet, and you can drive for miles without seeing another car. Phone reception disappears, streetlights are rare, and everything feels strangely isolated. I left my sister's place around 8:30 on Sunday night. Looking back, that decision was pretty stupid. I had work early the next morning and thought I'd just get the drive over with instead of waking up early to do it Monday. At the time, it seemed reasonable. For the first couple hours, nothing unusual happened. The highway had already narrowed to a simple two-lane road like most rural stretches up there. The traffic was non-existent. Right around the area near a small coastal forest, the fog started to roll in. Fog along that coastline isn't uncommon, but this was intense. Within minutes the visibility dropped dramatically. What had been a clear road suddenly turned into a gray wall where I could barely see more than 20 feet ahead of my headlights. I slowed down to around 35 miles per hour. The smarter move probably would have been to pull over somewhere and wait it out, but stopping spots are rare out there. Plus, I just wanted to get home. I figured as long as I drove carefully, it would be fine. But thick fog does something strange to your mind. You lose your sense of distance. The surroundings disappear. You can't see landmarks or road signs until they're right in front of you. Everything starts to feel distorted and confusing, especially when you're tired. After about 30 minutes of creeping along the road, I noticed something ahead on the shoulder. At first it just looked like a silhouette. As I got closer, it became clear that it was a person, a tall man standing just off the side of the road. He wasn't trying to wave me down, and he didn't look like he was walking anywhere either. He was just standing there, facing the road. I slowed down even more as I passed him, worried he might step into traffic. But he didn't move. He didn't even turn his head to follow my car as I drove by. I remember thinking that was extremely strange. My first assumption was that maybe his car had broken down somewhere nearby and he was waiting for help. But the weird part was that I hadn't passed any parked vehicles, and there was nothing around that would explain why he was standing there. For a second I thought about turning around to ask if he needed help. But something about the situation didn't sit right with me. So I kept driving. About 10 minutes later, something happened that made my stomach drop. Through the fog ahead, I saw another person standing on the shoulder. At least, I thought it was another person. As I approached, I realized it looked exactly like the first man. Same height. Same dark clothing. Same posture, standing perfectly still and facing the road. The only difference was that this time he was standing on the opposite side. I actually said, "What the hell," out loud inside my car. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me. I hadn't seen a single car on that road, and there were no side roads or shortcuts anywhere nearby. The only logical explanation was that it was just someone else who happened to look similar. Still, I couldn't stop myself from looking as I passed. And when I did, I was almost certain it was the same person. This time, though, the man suddenly turned his head and locked eyes with me. The moment our eyes met, a wave of panic ran through me. Something about the way his head snapped toward me felt completely wrong. I instinctively sped up, pushing my car to around 45 miles per hour even though the fog was still thick. I just wanted to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever that was. Unfortunately the fog became even heavier a few minutes later, forcing me to slow down again because I could barely see the center line of the road. My thoughts were racing, trying to come up with a logical explanation for what I'd seen. Then my headlights caught something else ahead. There was another figure standing directly in the middle of the road. I slammed the brakes and brought the car to a stop. This person had a hood pulled over their head, hiding their face completely. Even though I couldn't see his features, I had the awful feeling that it was the same man again. He stood there without moving. I flashed my high beams a few times, hoping he would step aside. Nothing. The road was silent except for the sound of my engine idling. That's when I decided to back up. But the moment I checked my rearview mirror, my heart nearly stopped. There was someone behind my car. A figure slowly walking toward me through the fog. I shouted in shock and immediately threw the car back into drive. I didn't care anymore. I was getting out of there. I swerved into the opposite lane and sped past the hooded figure blocking the road. He didn't try to stop me. For a moment I thought I was in the clear. Then something slammed violently into the back of my car. The impact was powerful enough to jerk the entire vehicle sideways. I heard a loud grinding crunch, like metal bending against something solid. I fought the steering wheel and managed to keep control of the car. My first thought was that another vehicle had rear-ended me. But when I checked the mirrors, there was nothing behind me. No headlights. No cars. And no people. That was the moment the situation went from frightening to completely surreal. I didn't stop. I kept driving as fast as I safely could through the fog. Eventually I reached a highway interchange where the fog finally started to clear. For the first time in over an hour, I could actually see the road again. My nerves slowly started to settle. And the more I thought about everything that happened, the more I convinced myself that exhaustion had gotten the best of me. I had been driving for nearly 4 hours, staring into dense fog on a dark highway with no other cars around. Hallucinating a few figures didn't seem impossible under those conditions. Even the crash might have just been me clipping a guardrail or a roadside marker while panicking. By the time I got home, all I wanted was sleep. But before going inside, I walked around to check my car. And that's when I froze. The rear bumper was completely crushed. A huge dent stretched across most of it, as if something had slammed into my car with serious force. But there was no paint transfer. No debris. Nothing to suggest another vehicle had hit me. Just the damage. I reported the incident to the police the next day, though I didn't expect anything to come from it. Over the years I've tried to rationalize that night. The explanation I settled on is that exhaustion caused me to hallucinate the figures, and in my panic I probably backed into or struck a roadside object. But there's one part I've never been able to explain. If the figures were hallucinations, then what actually hit my car? And why did it feel like something was trying to stop me from leaving that road? This happened during spring break earlier this year, so it's still pretty fresh in my mind. My name's Alex, and I'm currently finishing my senior year of college. Like I do most breaks, I went back to my hometown for the week. The problem with going home is that there's absolutely nothing happening there. It's one of those suburban towns that technically sits near a big city, but it doesn't actually feel connected to it. There's no nightlife, no bars within walking distance, and basically nothing to do unless you drive somewhere else. When I'm at school I'm always busy, but when I go home the place feels completely dead. To make matters worse, none of my old friends had the same break schedule as me. I still talk to a handful of people from high school, but every single one of them either had classes that week or had already taken their break earlier in the month. So I was staring down an entire week of boredom. Around that time I had also been trying to cut back on some habits, mostly nicotine and drinking. I figured being stuck at home with nothing going on could either make that worse or help me reset a little. I decided to use the time to focus on exercise. My plan was simple: lift weights in the mornings and go for a run every afternoon just to keep myself busy. That's how I ended up going for a run one random Tuesday evening. Back when I ran cross-country in high school, I had a loop I used all the time. The full route is exactly 3 miles. It starts at my parents' house, cuts through my neighborhood for a short stretch, then leads into a wooded trail that winds through a small forest before bringing you back out onto the road about a block from home. Between freshman and senior year, I must have run that route hundreds of times. The best part of the run is the trail section. Pavement is rough on your knees, but the dirt path through the woods is soft and quiet. I always liked running there because it felt calm and secluded. I left the house around 5 in the afternoon. Sunset was still a couple hours away, so I wasn't worried about the light. What I did notice immediately, though, was the fog. It was unbelievably thick. I've lived in that town my entire life and I've never seen fog like that before. It almost looked artificial, like the kind of hazy atmosphere you see in certain video games or those aesthetic background videos online. Anything farther than maybe 30 feet away just disappeared into gray. For a moment I thought about skipping the run. But I convinced myself it would be fine. The trail in the woods is extremely simple, just one long path with no forks or intersections. I knew that route so well I felt like I could probably run it blindfolded. Getting lost wasn't even something I considered possible. I had my running watch on to track my distance and pace. I started jogging, made it through the neighborhood section, and entered the woods. Inside the trees, the fog was even thicker. The branches blocked out most of the remaining daylight, so visibility dropped to maybe 15 or 20 feet ahead of me. Still, the trail itself was easy to follow. For the first mile and a half, everything felt normal. I was moving a bit slower than usual because I couldn't see very far ahead, but otherwise the run was going fine. I checked my watch around the 1 mile mark, then again around a mile and a half. The weird part started when I reached roughly 2.5 miles. At that point in the loop, I should have been close to the exit of the woods. The trail curves left, climbs a small hill, and then you're back on pavement. I know that section by memory. But when I looked down at my watch and saw 2.5 miles, I was still surrounded by trees. At first I assumed the watch was acting up. It was several years old, and GPS signals can get messed up under dense tree cover. The fog might have been interfering too. That explanation seemed reasonable enough, so I kept running that I left the house. Then my watch passed 3 miles. That's when I knew something was wrong. 3 miles should have put me back at my house or at least on the street nearby. Instead, I was still running along the same dirt path with trees on both sides and no sign of the trail ending. So I stopped. I'm not a paranoid person, and I'm definitely not superstitious. There had to be some logical explanation for what was happening. I stood there catching my breath and trying to think it through. But nothing made sense. There's only one trail in those woods. No forks, no alternate routes, nothing. The only way I could have gotten lost would be if I'd wandered off the path and into the brush, which I definitely hadn't done. I checked my watch again. 3.1 miles. Even stranger, the distance kept increasing while I was standing still. That confirmed the GPS was completely malfunctioning. At that point I had 2 choices, keep running forward and hope I eventually reach the exit, or turn around and retrace my steps. Turning back seemed smarter. If I ran the way I came, I'd eventually reach the trail entrance where I started. So I turned around and began running back. By then the fog had gotten even worse. I didn't know how that was possible, but visibility had dropped even further. I slowed down just to make sure I stayed on the path. After about another mile of running, so roughly 4 miles total, I heard something behind me. Normally the woods are silent. It's a small patch of forest and there usually aren't many animals around, so hearing any kind of sound out there immediately grabbed my attention. But the sound itself was far worse. I had never heard anything like it. The closest thing I can compare it to is a moan, but that's not quite accurate. It was deeper and more drawn out. The tone rose and fell repeatedly, almost like a siren, but it sounded disturbingly human. It was wrong in a way that's hard to describe. It didn't sound like someone calling for help, and it didn't sound like someone in pain either. It was just this long, wavering drone echoing through the trees. I started running faster. But by that point I had already covered more than 4 miles, and my legs were getting tired. The harder I pushed myself, the more exhausted I became, and the more frightened I felt. The sound didn't stop. No matter how fast I ran, whatever was making that noise seemed to keep pace with me. I looked over my shoulder several times. Every time, I saw nothing but fog. I ran like that for what felt like forever. Eventually, after what seemed like an eternity, I finally burst out of the woods and onto the street. I nearly collapsed from exhaustion. The fog outside was still incredibly thick. I turned back toward the trail. And that's when I saw it. Something was standing in the middle of the path just inside the tree line. I say, something, because I genuinely don't know what else to call it. All I could make out was a dark silhouette, a tall, shapeless figure. And it was huge. I'm about 6'1", and that thing had to be at least a foot taller than me. It wasn't walking toward me or moving away. It was just standing there. Watching. I could feel it. The only movement I noticed was a slight swaying motion, like it was gently rocking back and forth. If it hadn't been for that, I might have convinced myself it was just a tree. The strange droning sound had completely stopped. But I wasn't about to stick around to investigate. I turned and ran all the way home without looking back. That happened a few weeks ago. I'm back at school now, but I still can't stop thinking about that night. I can't get the image of that tall black shape out of my head, or the sound that followed me through the woods. I told my parents about it, of course. They both think it was probably just a tall person trying to scare me or maybe someone dangerous hiding in the woods. I guess that's possible. This happened about 5 years ago, sometime in early October. My friend Marcus and I had been planning a kayaking trip around Grayson Bay for what felt like forever. We talked about doing it for nearly 2 years before we finally committed to a weekend and made it happen. If you've never heard of Grayson Bay, it's a huge tidal inlet along the Washington coast, easily over 20 miles across in some places. Most of it is oyster beds, marshland, and protected wildlife areas. On a good day it's incredibly calm and beautiful. The day we picked was not one of those good days. For context, neither Marcus nor I were beginners. We'd both been kayaking since we were kids. Marcus even worked as a kayak guide during a couple summers while he was in college. We knew how to navigate coastal water, read tides, and handle ourselves out there. So what happened that morning still bothers me, because it wasn't a case of two inexperienced guys getting spooked by something they didn't understand. We launched early Saturday morning from a small access point near a coastal town. The fog was incredibly thick, but that's not unusual in that part of Washington. Usually it burns off by mid-morning once the sun climbs higher. We brought all the normal gear, GPS, compass, emergency radio. The plan was simple: paddle out toward a nearby island, maybe watch some birds, eat lunch on a sandbar, then head back before the tide started shifting in the afternoon. For the first hour, everything went exactly as planned. The fog created that strange quiet you get on the ocean when sound gets muffled. It felt like we were paddling through a giant cloud. Visibility was terrible, maybe 40 feet at most, but we stayed close together and checked our direction often. Around 9 in the morning, I heard something. At first I thought Marcus had splashed his paddle. He was about 15 feet to my left, and it would have made sense if he'd changed his stroke or something. But when I looked over, his paddle was resting across his kayak. He looked at me and asked if I'd heard that. I nodded. We both stopped paddling and listened. The sound came again. It was the rhythmic splash of oars. And I mean oars specifically, not paddles. Anyone who spends enough time on the water can hear the difference. Paddles slice into the water differently. Oars have a heavier, more deliberate sound. Somewhere off to our right, maybe 100 feet away, someone was rowing a boat. Marcus shrugged and said it was probably another person out on the bay. That seemed reasonable enough. People fish out there all the time, and occasionally other kayakers explore the area too. The fog was thick enough that we couldn't see them, but sound travels strangely over water, especially in fog. Sometimes things seem closer than they are. We drifted for a moment, expecting whoever it was to either appear through the mist or call out. That's pretty normal boating etiquette when visibility is bad, you let others know where you are. But the rowing just kept going. Steady. Slow. Perfectly consistent. Marcus eventually called out, "Hello," toward the fog. No response. The oars kept dipping into the water with the same calm rhythm, like whoever was rowing hadn't even heard him. After another minute we started paddling again. We figured we'd eventually run into the person, or they'd pass by us. But something strange started happening. For the next 20 minutes, the sound of those oars never got any closer or farther away. It stayed exactly the same distance. At first it was just odd. Then it started getting unsettling. The rhythm never changed either. Whoever was rowing had this unbelievably steady pace, stroke after stroke, identical timing every single time. Marcus and I weren't talking much anymore, but I could tell he was thinking the same thing I was. Eventually we adjusted our direction slightly, angling east toward the shoreline. For a brief moment the fog thinned enough for me to see something. A small rowboat. It floated in the water about 50 or 60 feet away. I could just barely see the outline of someone sitting at the oars. Then the fog swallowed it again. The whole glimpse lasted maybe 3 seconds. I asked Marcus if he'd seen it. He said yes. That was when my stomach started to knot up. There was nothing overtly threatening about the situation. It was just someone rowing a boat. But the fact that they never acknowledged us, never changed direction, and seemed to be keeping the exact same distance from us, it felt wrong. I told Marcus I wanted to head for shore. Without arguing, he turned his kayak in the same direction. Navigating the bay in thick fog isn't simple, even with GPS. Sandbars move with the tides, shallow areas appear where you don't expect them, and you can get stuck in mud flats if you're not careful. Still, we pointed ourselves southeast and started paddling harder. The rowing sound followed us the entire time. Every few seconds I glanced to the right, hoping to see the boat again. I never did. Then, suddenly, the fog began to thin. It didn't disappear completely, but visibility improved enough that we could see maybe 100 yards around us. The first thing I did was look toward the sound. Nothing. Just open water. I turned around and scanned behind us. Also empty. Marcus was doing the same thing, turning in his seat and searching the water in every direction. There was no boat anywhere. And the rowing sound had stopped. The shore came into view a few minutes later. Relief washed over me. We paddled straight toward land without worrying about finding a perfect place to dock. When the water got shallow enough, I jumped out and dragged my kayak onto the sand. The water was freezing, but I barely noticed. I was just happy to be standing on solid ground. For a minute we just stood there breathing heavily, staring out across the bay. Marcus walked a short distance up the beach while I secured my kayak. A moment later he called for me to come look at something. When I reached him, my stomach dropped again. There were footprints in the sand. Bare footprints. They were wet, and you could still see water pooled inside the impressions. Whoever made them had come out of the water recently. But the strange part was the direction. The prints didn't just stop on the beach. They came out of the water, crossed the sand, turned along the shoreline, and then eventually cut into the trees at the edge of the forest. I traced the line of prints with my eyes. They stretched further down the beach, meaning whoever made them had walked along the shoreline before reaching the spot where we had just landed. Marcus said we should leave. But I couldn't stop staring at them. Something about the whole situation had been bothering me since we first heard those oars. I told him I wanted to follow the footprints, not into the forest, but the other way, toward where they started. Marcus thought I was insane. But he also didn't want to stand there alone. After a brief argument, he reluctantly agreed. We walked along the beach, following the trail. After about 2 minutes, I saw it. A small wooden rowboat sat pulled halfway onto the sand about 50 yards ahead of us. The wood was dark, almost black, and the oars rested inside it. I knew immediately it was the same boat I'd seen through the fog. Same shape. Same size. Same color. A line of wet footprints led from the boat toward the beach. I started walking toward it. Marcus grabbed my arm. He told me we were leaving. Not asked. Leaving. The way he said it made my curiosity disappear instantly. Whoever had been rowing that boat had somehow reached shore before us, in a slower vessel, then walked down the beach to the exact place we landed, and still had time to vanish into the forest. We didn't say another word. We rushed back to the kayaks, shoved them into the water, and paddled away as fast as we could. That was years ago now, and I've thought about that morning countless times. The most reasonable explanation would be that someone was messing with us. But even that doesn't really make sense. We spent over 2 hours on the water, changing directions multiple times before finally heading straight for shore. For that rowboat to beat us there, the person would have had to reach land before us, walk a long stretch of beach to the exact spot where we landed, and disappear. All without us ever seeing them. It's so strange that even now I can't fully explain it. And honestly, after all this time, I'm not sure I want to.